Hi everyone. My name is Valeria Korablyova. I'm Senior Research Fellow at the Department of East European Studies, Charles University. On behalf of the organizational team, I'm happy to welcome you all to the third Ukrainian Studies in Prague conference. In this traumatic for the global community year of 2020, we decided to raise again the topic of trauma and of the post-colonial condition in Ukraine, to discuss their lasting potential as well as their limits. The title Trauma Nation should be read with a question mark, as rather than being an affirmation, it is more an invitation to challenge it and to think together in this direction. After the breakthrough studies on the post-colonial status of Ukraine, published in 1990s and 2000s by our distinguished speakers, whom we are happy and honored to host, even if virtually, over these 2 days. This field of inquiry became quite well established in the regional area studies. However, its position in the post-colonial studies at large, aka former Third World studies, is far less definite. An important question we want to raise is where we shall proceed from here. Hence, the second part, Ukraine at a crossroads. We are deeply grateful to all the speakers for having kindly accepted our invitation and found a time slot in their, I could imagine, pretty packed schedules. Big thanks go to the conference team who launched this event and kept it running for 3 years now. And a special thank you goes to the head of the Department of East European Studies, Dr. Stanislav Tumis, who supported us through and through. I'm passing the floor to Stanislav in a moment. Just let me briefly introduce him. Dr. Tumis has a long-standing research interest in both the history of Ukraine and in the post-colonial studies. Out of the impressive list of his publications, I want to mention just one which is the most relevant for today's conversation. It is a solid edited volume published in 2015 with the telling title, Pre-colonialism, Colonialism, Post-colonialism. The empires and the others in Eastern and Southeastern Europe. So, without further ado, Stanislav, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Valeria. Ladies and gentlemen, respectable professors, dear colleagues, students, it is my big pleasure. I can welcome you already on the third Ukrainian conference in Prague, organized by Institute of East European Studies, Faculty of Arts, Charles University, together with our traditional cooperators and supporters, namely the Institute for the Study of Strategic Regions, Charles University, represented by Professor Olga Lomova and Secretary Jan Bichovský, and also the Czech Association of Ukrainists in the Czech Republic. I strongly appreciate that international conference of Ukrainists have already become tradition, as the first conference was organized in November 2017 with approximately 50 participants, and the second conference in November 2018, which was a little bit smaller event, but offered a number of important papers, including the keynote lectures delivered by Professor Serhii Plochy. Both two conferences were organized under auspice of Ukrainian Embassy in Prague, represented by His Excellency Yevhen Perebeynis. So we thank for this support. This year, the third conference presents the papers under the subtitle A Trauma Nation, Ukraine at a Crossroad, which I consider to be the very viable topic in today's discussions about the past and present Ukraine. I am delighted I can welcome a number of distinguished scholars dealing with the topic of Ukraine from several institutions and countries of the world. Unfortunately, due to current situation, we have been enforced to organize this conference online, what prevent us from personal meetings and discussions, which have always comprised an important part of all Ukrainian conferences. But this situation can be understood as an opportunity as well, as it helps us to meet across borders, boundaries, and even oceans. We feel to be indebted to the tradition of Prague Ukrainist conferences, and even today, we have already been planning another 4th conference in the following years. We believe that Prague and Charles University can serve as one of the focal points of Ukrainian studies, thanks to the tradition of this study at the Charles University and Prague as one of the most important places of Ukrainian emigration in Europe and world. Last but not least, I would like to express my special thanks to Radomir Mokrik and Valeria Korablyova, who worked on organization of this conference for several months. I wish you to take advantage from this conference, and I believe it will be accompanied by fruitful discussions as well. So it's my introductory words to this conference, and I think we don't lose the time, so we can start with the first section of this conference. So maybe I should say some small information at the beginning that every contribution should have approximately 20 to 25 minutes. So please try to respect it. And also I was asked by organizers that questions in the end, or that questions should be given in the end of panel. So we will discuss after all contributions will be delivered. But of course you can write, and I would like to encourage you, you can write continuously your questions in chat. So I try to select some important questions, maybe some can repeat, so we can make our best, to give all questions in the end of this section. So now it is a time to start with the first section of this conference, in which I will serve as a chair. Let me introduce you the first participant in this section, and it is my great pleasure to welcome here Professor Yaroslav Hrytsak, whom I haven't to introduce so much because his work is known to majority of us. Professor Hrytsak is an Ukrainian historian, doctor of historical sciences, and professor at the Ukrainian Catholic University. He is a member of a number of institutions dealing with Ukrainian studies and a number of additional editorial boards of several journals as Ab Imperium, Critic, Slavic Review, or Harvard Ukrainian Studies. He is also an author of a number of publications, for example, Narys Istorie Ukrainy and others. So today he will present his paper, Is a Third Ukraine Viable? So Professor Hrytsak, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Professor Tumis, for your kind introduction, your kind words. Thank you, Valeria, and thank you, Radomir, for organizing this brilliant event. I have to confess that I have some technical problems. My computer has collapsed. I'm trying to make my presentation from my iPad, and I'm not sure whether I could manage with my PowerPoint. I do my best, but somehow it doesn't allow me to show the screen. I wonder if I could have a right to be a host for a while. Or this is possible technically? If not, they have to, no other option but just to tell you in my own words without PowerPoints. I presented.
I believe you are a host now, so
please do. Well, thank you so much.
No problem.
Thank you so much. You are very kind, Valeria. I won't forget it. Okay. So I have to say from the very beginning that my presentation would sound somewhat optimistic, so probably won't deal that much with the trauma, and I'm sorry for that. I choose this topic, Third Ukraine, is it viable, as a way to talk about issues and some of the recent changes, which are quite often overlooked by many experts and observers. The reason being that we really address such a unit of the analysis of generation. And I believe generation is very important, and what describes best the recent development in Ukraine is exactly the change in generational change. So I would start with the article, which at some point impressed me very much and served as a kind of source inspiration. This article has been written by Mikhailo Dubyansky, who himself is a very kind of the important figure. He's a public intellectual, has been born and raised in Crimea. He's Russian speaking, but he moved to Ukraine, to Kyiv, and now he himself considered to be Ukrainian, which is not a kind of rare story in Ukraine, such a mix. Even so, he's a very public figure. He is public intellectual, he's not a public figure, because he really appears in public, so to say. He's kind of enigmatic figure, but he writes a good text. And 10 years ago, exactly 10 years ago, a few months after the victory of Yanukovych at the presidential elections, he wrote an article, Ukrainska Pravda, Zolota Seredina. And basically, in this article, he was addressing the most pertinent, persistent issue in Ukraine, and this is possibility, or rather a danger, of breakup of Ukraine in eastern and western part. In the Russian-speaking east and the Ukrainian-speaking west, this is, as I say, a very persistent problem. Let me just say that in 1993, the CIA came with prognosis that Ukraine is heading to a civil war between West and East, and comparing with the Yugoslav war, and I'm quoting him verbatim, this war would look like the Yugoslav war would look like an innocent picnic. So basically, Dubyansky was suggesting a solution. So he says the only viable solution is to create a new opposition which will be a civic opposition, which will be free, could act as an independent player, and which could be free of the ethnic-cultural markers, like language, historical question, issues like that, that would criticize Yanukovych not because he is Russophile, his Russophile orientation, but because of his mismanagement and his corruption. And this point was repeated later on by the first Ukrainian president, Leonid Kravchuk. I'm sorry, this keep disappearing. And actually, Kravchuk says basically the same. There are three Ukraines nowadays. The one is the Soviet Ukraine, and this is like a burden of the past, and this is Bolshevik Soviet, and actually he sees this is the Ukraine of extremes, Ukraine of the communist, and Ukraine of the nationalist, because I believe the nationalist is also the part of the Soviet story. And this is both Ukraine of Semenenko and Ternebok. This is the old Soviet Ukraine. The second Ukraine is a new Ukraine, is Ukraine of sincere Ukrainians who love everything Ukrainian, like Ukraine of Sharovarach. And he believed that the best embodiment of this Ukraine is Viktor Yushchenko. But there says there are third Ukraine, and it's presented by normal Ukrainians who love the Ukraine, which are nationals in a way, but they also very much think and act globally. And he believes this is the best part of Ukraine, and then future belongs to them. So this is just a statement. What I would claim that both those statements reflect some new reality, which I say again, have to repeat, has been ignored or overlooked by many analysts. And I would just as an illustration to the new reality, I will start with this map. You are familiar with this map, but this map has been represented quite often, and this is the map that comes from the Washington Post article that has been published at the very beginning of the Maidan. You see the date, and it basically tries to explain what is going in Ukraine in Maidan by the one simple map. And this map is the linguistic division of Ukraine, which just sounds very familiar, looks very familiar, the one that what Dubyansky was addressing. So, and this basically, the claim was that this map explains everything. In contrast to this map, I would like to draw the attention to the next map. This you see now on the screen. This is the map of the final date of Maidan. And this is a different object. It's not all population in Ukraine, it's the users of the networks, social networks, Kontakte. And the red dots and the more intensive red dots, brown dots, they indicate the support for Maidan. And as you could see from this map, that with the exception of Donbass and Crimea, all other Ukraine was supportive of Maidan. I mean, network users, so to say. By definition, who know who the users are? They're mostly, more often than not, they're youngsters, they're people with the higher university education, and they're people with the people who belongs to the so-called, sorry, I have a technical problem here, and people who represents the middle class and mostly live in the large and urban cities. So I believe this is exactly what they were referring to, the emergence of this new group of the people. So in my estimates, and estimates as a social scientist, they represent certain between 15 to 30 population, depends on criteria we use, which is a large. And I would say that the emergence, the appearance of this young new generation, the new social middle class, I would call it, is a result of the very recent changes that started in the 0 years. And probably the best way to describe these changes is to look on this scheme, the scheme represents the shift or change of the GNP in Ukraine, the structure. This is the share of the post-industrial service economy. What we see here, that sometimes in the middle of the 0 years, we have a kind of the radical change. The largest part of the national gross national product has been produced not by industrial sectors, by the service economy. And this is tremendous shift, which has been, as I say again, has been overlooked. And this shift has a very important social and political implications. First of all, the change of the economical geography. This is the map which I like very much. This is a map of Ukraine by night, so to say. It's been taken from a space. And you probably know that this kind of the lighting of the city is probably one of the best indicator of economic activity. What we see from this map as the industrial east during these years, which I'm describing, is slowly fading out, getting darker, while the social and economic capital moves more to the west, while the center is the most brightest point. In a way, it's a new, very new phenomenon, and this also represents or affected by the emergence of the new middle class, which had been largely absent. Here is the numbers. You unfortunately have these tables only in Ukrainian language. You could see this is the strategic четверті, the two numbers. You could easily see that the numbers of the middle class that is in Ukraine during the 0 years has doubled from 20 to 30%. Here is the very much technical, very much technical definition of the middle class, the one who could save some money, so to say. And this is, I believe, very much important indicator. So basically what I'm trying to say here, if we use all this kind of the effect of this cumulative change, we come to a conclusion that we have some kind of the new realities in Ukraine. And the last but not least, this new reality is a level education. Ukraine has one of the largest, on the biggest scores in the number of the people who has a university diploma. Nowadays, university diploma become practically universal. I don't mean to say that this education is of good quality on any rate, but it doesn't really matter what kind of qualities. What matters is that they spend their time on the university. Because the general presumption is that if people are spending some time at the university, they tend to have kind of new values, so-called values of self-expression. And this results in the political changes. So my point, if I make some kind of conclusion this part, so we tend to believe that Euromaidan has initiated some large important processes. I would say that this is true, but only to a certain extent. I see the Euromaidan not a result, not as a kind of the initial starting point, as a kind of process that triggered some of the process, but the kind as a result of the processes that started earlier in the 0 years, which means to say we are dealing with some kind of long-term tendency. And I believe this tendency covers both the first Maidan, but most importantly, the second Maidan. And basically, to large extent, not exclusively, but to large extent, the second Maidan exactly was the result of the emergence of this new middle class, which is simultaneously class and generation. More or less people in the age of between 8 and 30, 35. Could be described briefly as a generation independence. The people who have been born after proclamation of Ukrainian independence. So this is the good point, the good news. Now the bad news. The bad news that actually I would like to draw your attention to this kind of the Zizek article of what Europe should learn from Ukraine. I rarely agree with Slavoj Zizek, but this time I believe he has a point, because it says that basically he was writing this article right after the Maidan, the victory of Maidan, that Ukrainian protesters heroes, but the true fight begins now. And the fight was for what Ukraine will be. And he warned that the main danger, the main pitfalls that Ukraine should be hard to avoid, to escape, would be the problems of the oligarch state, which is very much entrenched in Ukraine. And second, the temptation of nationalizing state. So instead of embarking on reforms, the new power will try to build a new national identity. And this, in this way, would divert the efforts from the reforms and so on, and so forth, and so forth. So I believe in this case, he has a true point here, because what has been a very good start in the 2014 basically ended in the failure. The failure had a various dimensions. First of all, we know that civic activity, activists, volunteers, they play an extremely important role in building army, in defense, and they probably, would be exaggeration to say that they saved Ukraine in 2014 from the aggression, from the Russian aggression. But point is that in the few years, they has been, so to say, exhausted, and the civic activity, in many ways, and there has been many important indication, has just faded away. And there is a very important article at that time has been written by Katerina Shmagli, that a wake-up call for Ukrainian civil society, because he was warning that Ukrainian society is returning to political apathy. At the same time, we have this kind of story, bad stories on the Yemleshchenko, Zalishchuk, they call 3 musketeers, who were kinds of symbols of this new middle class, tarnished leaders. For sure, it was not just their fault. It was not just them to blame, because at the same time, we were facing the attacks on civic activists. There was approximately 40 attacks on civic activists. No one person has been named and brought to justice, and probably the most important case was the Katerina Handzuk. But the point is here that what Slavoj Zizek was warning us exactly it's what was happening, that Ukraine was focusing instead of reform, which has been stopped from the first year on the political identities, with the communization, building national identity. I wouldn't say this is a great harm. In a sense, it's been unavoidable, given the Russian aggression, given the current situation. You couldn't escape this kind of the identity building. But still, this kind of what happened there was a kind of a very unlucky correlation, because the less reforms, the more national politics, the more national identity politics, the more nationalizing state. So there is one impression at some point that this kind of national politics building a new national memory was served as like a fig leaf to mask the lack of the reforms. So, and the other new occurrences, which I believe was bringing some kind of the hope, was that instead of was kind of the balance of the failure of the state, there was still emerging some good, excuse me, I'm just confused with this kind of presentation. I couldn't do the two things at once. So what I'm trying to say, I've just stopped for a while. So what we have here, that in the, as a result of these changes, we have the emergence of new leaders, which could be called as the real voice of the third Ukraine. We know that the new generation is a kind of social concept, and it's more than biological concept. It's not the same people who are born the same years, so to say, because to turn them into from biological to social concept, you have to give them a voice. There has to be somebody who should articulate, who could articulate this voice, and we have a clear leaders of this articulation, like Serhiy Zhadan or Vakarchuk, the rock singer, that I believe should not be introduced because he is a very known figure for many of us. So the point is, it looks like this generation is getting a voice. And probably just a kind of direct answer to this, the one of the main political project of this time was the party which was founded by Vakarchuk or Haidar Vakarchuk, which is directly called Holos. And at some point, it has a very good chances to become one of the leading parties of Ukraine. And even Vakarchuk was considered one of the best candidates, probably one of the most potential candidates for Ukrainian presidency. So what happened then, and we know this kind of the story, there's not much to say. I would say that this kind of momentum, very important momentum of this rise of the generation, of the civic activity, of the new leader, has been hijacked by the populist Sluha Narodu, Zelensky, all the kind of things. And basically this what happened that nowadays, this is Zelensky who represents or seems to represent this new third Ukraine. And what comes with the Holos, you probably know this kind of results, that the Holos itself became, instead of being the liberal or national project, its term has been reduced to Galician only. So given the last result, the last elections, the local elections, there is a chance that, not the chance, a tendency that many predicted that the nowadays ruling party will lose in popularity, and we may face return to the two Ukraines. Ukraines of Poroshenko and Ukraines of PSG, of the pro-Russian opposition. So we may be thrown back to situation of 210, so to say. So this is something which I believe is a really case scenario, and you could really seriously consider this as one of the potential scenario for the future, for the near future of Ukraine. And this is a bad news. It's probably a very bad news. And I believe, I'm afraid that Ukraine is now facing a very serious crisis, both economical, political, partly related to coronavirus, but more than that, mostly because of the competence of the nowadays power. So this, we have to be, so to say, ready for this crisis. I'm not happy to say that, but let's face it, that's a fact. What are the good news? The good news is that the tendency is still there. This new middle class is still there. And this has been testified by the recent wave of the Volvo survey in 2020. So basically what it says, that this tendency or shift or drift of Ukraine from the values of survival to the values of self-expression is still going on. Despite the war, despite the economic crisis, the tendency is still there. It looks like a miracle. It's very hard to believe, but still I believe this is because it's related to this kind of the changes we try to describe that started in the 0 years. And if you look on this map, I wonder you could read this map, but probably you could have this presentation shared later, that basically what it says there, to make this long story short, that this generation that has been born already during the first Ukrainian independence, it's drastically different. and even different from the generation that has been born, say, by the last year of the Soviet Union. So what I'm saying here, that we have long-term tendency. Even if this tendency has not been consumed, it doesn't say that it is not there. So I may risk a conclusion as a historian. If we are to believe that Ukraine experienced revolutionary transition, and I believe it does, Ukraine comes through the kind of very painful, dramatic, but still revolutionary process, then we have to take into account that revolutionary changes, if they fail initially, they may win in the longer run. And I'm talking now as a historian, not as a scientist or political analyst. Say the spring of the nation, the 1848, is famously known as a turning point at which history failed to turn. But 70 years later, right after the First World War, the revolutionary demands of the 1848 became a trivia. It became a part of the new geopolitical order. The same goes with the 1968 Youth Revolution, which is especially prominent in Czechoslovakia in Prague. Even if it failed initially, it largely created the world we are living now. So my conclusion or my suggestion is that we have to give the third Ukraine a benefit of the doubt. And since we are dealing with a generation change, and this is a generation change, I have to emphasize it, then within the next 10 years, the decade when the young generation will mature and come in the middle age, say the 30s, 40s, we may expect the more positive changes. In any rate, this may be a very decisive decade for Ukraine. What is important, and I believe I will emphasize this again, that the tendency is there, and it seems to be irreversible. So what is left is just wait to see and to act. And I would just say that probably as a very conclusion that what is there, that by focusing on this kind of trauma, identity, politics, things like that, I believe it's necessary. We have discussed these issues because they make a significant part of our past and all the kind of things. But still, we have somehow to look for a shift in focuses on our analysis because there's new realities and have to face them. But the best way to face them is to look them at the long-term perspective. So it doesn't mean that this perspective is very kind of optimistic. Most probably Ukraine would face not one, but several crises as it used before, but still it just gives us Ukraine a very good benefit of the doubt. Thank you so much. And I'm sorry for technical applications.
No, it's okay. So we have to count with it. So thank you very much for your contribution. So again, I remind you that discussion will follow after the end of this section, and I would like to encourage you again, like Valeria in chat, so you can write your questions to Professor Hrytsak and also other participants in this section. So please write them because maybe it will be technically the best way how to pose questions. Okay, so now it's a time to introduce you our second participant in this section, Valeria Korablyova. She is currently senior researcher at Charles University Department of East European Studies. She received her habilitation in 2015 from Taras Shevchenko National University in Kiev, where till recently she worked as professor of philosophy. Her research interests include post-communist transformations in Ukraine and East Central Europe with a specific focus on mass protests and nation building. She has been holding a number of fellowships in international institutions at Stanford University, University of Warsaw, Charles University, University of Basel, etc. Her later book, Social Meanings of Ideology, covers ideological transformations of European modernity, the Maidan uprising being a particular case in point. Today, she will present her paper, Extracoloniality as a Political and Epistemological Strategy for Ukraine. So, Valeria, floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Stanislav, for this kind introduction. I did like your Freudian slip. I wish we were extracolonial today and finally escaped the corona crisis, but we are not there yet. Pan Yaroslav, I'm afraid I will have to ask you to give me back the host privilege, if possible. Or I will just try. Professor Hrytsak?
I would gladly do it if I knew how to do it.
You should just click on my name and make me a host again, because otherwise I can't share my screen.
So I click you.
It's all right. We can see the screen. We can see you well.
Yeah, wonderful, but you can't see my presentation unless I'm a host.
Well, I don't know.
But thank you for your support, yeah.
Okay, rename. What does it say? Mute spotlight for everyone, rename. What should I do, rename?
No.
It said host me. Why? How could I take the host away? Stanislav Tumis co-host, Radomir Mokra co-host. Radomir, probably you could do it from your computer.
No.
Radomir, can you make me, what is my status currently? Am I a co-host?
Okay, I'll make, oh, now I see. I'll make you a host, okay? Now
Wonderful.
I see the point, okay. So you owe me. Okay, I'll make you a host. Okay, I did it.
Wonderful. I guess we're even now.
Miracle.
Thank you. So thank you, Yaroslav, for this good share of optimism. I think it's a good way to start this otherwise quite tough conversation. And I will move on with my presentation. Okay. So what okay, I hope you see it, right? So it's extracoloniality as a political and epistemological strategy for Ukraine. So what I'm suggesting to your attention today, these are my unfinished reflections on the post-colonial approach as applied to Ukraine. And I would start with a disclaimer that I'm not focusing on the post-colonial argument itself and the findings, possible findings in this domain, but rather I'm trying to take an external stance and to see how the popularization of the post-colonial approach, what political and psychological effects it entails. And for that matter, I'm trying to analytically distinguish between three main aspects here. I understand that the post-colonial studies are always loaded with political meanings and political effects. However, it's possible to define the epistemological aspect, which is basically about designing some specific narratives and explanatory models that reveal the contemporary Ukrainian situation at a certain angle and conveying some new truths about Ukraine. Then there is the political aspect, how the affirmation of the post-colonial status of Ukraine reverberates internationally and domestically. And finally, by placing coloniality in the center of nation building, what imprints on the mentality of Ukrainians it makes, how it affects the so-called national unconscious, because whenever we talk about the colonialism, it's always not only rational, but also it works on the level of subconsciousness. So the outline of my presentation is threefold. I will start with the political misuse and its limitation, briefly talking about the global context, the regional context, and the domestic situation. Then I will move on with the psychological imprints of the post-colonial mentality. And since I believe that they are dangerous, I will conclude with a way out or an alternative proposal, which I dub extracoloniality. So, the global context. It's no secret that the post-colonial studies have become trendy in the end of the 20th, beginning of the 21st century. As Leon Mosavi said, intellectual decolonization has become a fashionable way to promote social justice, because it has very important political effects. By claiming and proving the post-colonial status, the subject, by the same token, elevates its own moral and political status. And therefore, many subaltern regions, nations, social groups, so to speak, jumped on the decolonial bandwagon. However, this proliferation of post-colonial claims from different corners of the world somehow deflated the currency and the effect of these claims, and also they became in part mutually contradictory and therefore entangled in so-called competitive martyrology. We should keep an eye on the specific situation. Why is the very claim, the very fact of the claim for post-coloniality beneficial? It is possible only in a very specific setting, in a very specific moral setting, when it gives an added value, when it increases the moral status. And it's not ubiquitous. It is possible only within the moral culture of victimhood, which I will speak about in details later. However, outside of this moral culture of victimhood, it can bring rather different consequences. Because in some situation and in some contexts, the claims for the post-colonial status might reaffirm the peripheral position of the region. When some countries or nations claim that they had suffered from someone a lot, by the same token, some other actors might perceive that, yes, it's a periphery and it's negligible. So it's like a double-edged sword. Therefore, when talking about different post-colonial subaltern studies, and they are plentiful and very diverse, we should examine them. And there are several important questions that need to be raised, I believe. First of all, what is their rationale? Are they aiming to deconstruct the existing hierarchies of domination, or just to improve their position in them? Is it about enforcing and creating these sort of intersectional solidarities across various cleavages? Or is just about engaging in reverse discrimination and othering? So we are better, but at the same time, we're othering other sides and other actors. What is the core ethos, the core morality inside? Is it about the ethos of openness and inclusion, which necessarily implies a certain sensitivity to other traumas? Or it is a quite aggressive and militant stance? We have suffered, so we have the moral right to fight back. And finally, the ideological positionality. Does it exist within the sort of right-wing camp, enforcing quite radical nationalist, identitarian, if you wish, politics? Or it's more on the tentatively left wing, about some emancipatory projects, which are quite inclusive and open? Campbell and Manning, sociologists of morality, published a very interesting book several years back where they were talking about the moral culture. And by this notion, they mark a specific pattern of morality. And they explain that in various societies or sectors of societies, there are quite divergent perception of what is bad and what is good. And the so-called culture of victimhood is a very recent phenomenon where you can get some moral benefits and indeed elevate your status in this sort of symbolic hierarchy by proving that you are a victim, that you have suffered a lot. And in this configuration, which is very culturally and historically specific, it's not all over the world, and it's important to keep it in mind. In this configuration, victimhood is a kind of moral status based on suffering and neediness. And in this setting, by being a victim, one might elevate his or her status. It could be a means of reversing the done harm and even to punish the offender. What is also specific about this culture, several points which I believe are important to mention. It is a very strong sensitivity to details, to minor offense, to words, to labels, markers, and designations. And then the second part is that the very important figure in this configuration is not a victim and nor an offender, but the third party, a sort of independent judge whom both sides appeal to. And paradoxically, both sides are trying to prove that they are victims. And even an oppressor engages in this game, trying to prove that he is a real victim. So basically, that's how the whole story goes on. And I believe that the political effect of the post-colonial claims very much entrenched in this culture of victimhood. And it's a big question for how long it will last. Right now, it is contextualized. It's basically, it exists in the West, but due to a number of developments, it might collapse soon. So it makes sense to keep an eye on that. And now I move into the regional context. What's happening in our region? East Central Europe, the Baltic states, and obviously Poland is a very important case here. It turned out, as Spivak suspected even back in 1970s, that very often subaltern studies could be an entry ticket to essentialism. So rather than liberating the oppressed, it results into cultural essentialization and identitarianism. So basically it antagonizes the society and it's a powerful weapon against others. It enforces and endorses binary worldviews, operates via value judgments, and reinforces existing cleavages and creates new ones. And as I said, it creates a very specific setting of competitive martyrology when very uncomfortable questions are being raised, like, can we put Holocaust and Holodomor in the same symbolic row? Who is the real Christ of the nation? Who has the Messiah to rescue the world or Europe, and so on? And the Russian factor, of course, is very important here. It's an elephant in the room because, like, as some post-colonial scholars say, in order to successfully decolonialize, not like politically, but also mentally and culturally, what Mignolo calls decoloniality as opposite to decolonialism, then the other side has to make some efforts to de-imperialize itself, to make some self-reflexive work on itself. And what we observe right now is quite the opposite. Not only Russia does not want to de-imperialize, seemingly it tries to re-imperialize, to reinforce this rhetoric. And by the same token, it traps Ukraine in this colonial catch. It traps it in the past, because by being forced to engage in these continuous reproducing discussions about the past, it's as if Ukraine cannot jump into the future, being stuck. It's like an obsessive fixation on the oppressor. And as Anton Shevchenko called it, it's a reflexive control special operation. When you create a specific setting that whatever the choice your opponent makes, you always win. Whether you stick to the Russian rhetoric, then you lose your sovereignty. If you start opposing to this rhetoric, then you became the mirror image of Russia being asyntagonistic and militaristic. And therefore, like, there is no good solution. The good solution is to escape the whole conversation altogether. But how it is to be done, it's another question. And finally, the domestic repercussions. So what's happening here? The first one is obvious. It's tokenistic decolonization by political elites. Ukraine is not unique in this respect, and even Franz Fanon in 60s and Kijano in 70s, they were talking about this phenomenon that after the anti-colonial struggle, the new political elites that took the office on this anti-colonial wave, they somehow just reappropriate the existing structure and just benefit from them. And no expected substantial changes come into force. And therefore, they're just paying lip service to whatever rhetoric, but people do not feel the substantial changes in their position. They do not feel that they stopped being victims, just now they are oppressed by their new authorities. And that's pretty much the case in Ukraine, as we can judge by some sociological polls. in particular by the level of trust to institution and to different institutions and to the elites. Another very hard question, which I still need to raise, it's about the failed pedagogical mission of cultural elites. It's not a secret that cultural elites were very much inspired with the anti-colonial struggle, and based on the legacy of dissidents and anti-Soviet struggle, they were trying to use the post-colonial pathos for building national identity around it. And very often Poland was interpreted in this context as a positive model to emulate. Tomasz Zaricki wrote a number of publications, a Polish scholar, sociologist, where he proved that Poland is a very specific intelligentsia-dominated community, where cultural elites are sort of the new aristocracy, and they have a very high social standing in the society. In a way, they are a cultural hegemon. And the broad masses, if you wish, are very receptive to their ideas. But Ukraine has a very different setting. And I believe that the elections of 2019, which Yaroslav mentioned in his presentations, were a very clear indicator to that, when many opinion leaders and cultural elites unified behind one a presidential candidate, and people voted with overwhelming majority for another candidate, sending a signal that they are not being led by the cultural elites, and they are not that much receptive to cultural wars, but they want some socioeconomic problems to be solved in the first place. And finally, the third point here is the troublesome hierarchy of traumas. A famous sociologist, Jeffrey Alexander, explained the algorithm how traumas are being constructed in the societies. They are certainly related to real historical events, but however, some of these historical events are universalized, they're raised to a sort of all-national level, so they must be recognized as the trauma of the whole nation, becoming the sort of the founding trauma of the nation, which is similarly in the Ukrainian case, the Great Famine, the Holodomor, while other traumatic events are marginalized. They are perceived as a trauma of a specific region, a specific social group, or less important historical events. And any discussion and negotiations around that are sort of morally banned, because no one would dare to say that the Great Famine is not a catastrophe. It definitely is. But the way how it is constructed in this hierarchy, the problem with trauma is that it has to tackle you directly. And if it does not relate to you personally, you feel that it is imposed, and at the same time you are morally muted to say something against it. So what I'm trying to say here, that there were many traumas. Unfortunately, the Ukrainian history is very rich in this respect, and there is a wide choice here. But some people are personally associating themselves with the other trauma. I just will give one example. That would be definitely the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And here I do not mean those longing for the Soviet Union, whom Paul Tamas called the orphans of the Belovezha forest, but simply that for many people, it was not a happy event of final liberation, as it is presented in the official historiography, but it was a very scary event with indefinite consequences. And Pyotr Shtomka called it the trauma of the great change. Ivan Krastev called it the period of paralyzing uncertainty. And of course, the socioeconomic misery that followed only enforced this perception. And this trauma is not yet recognized and sort of retaliated, if you wish. And I do believe that the socioeconomic aspects that, according to all sociological polls, the majority of Ukrainians are very sensitive to, they need to be addressed properly, because otherwise it looks like trying to compensate with symbolic culture, memory wars for some other things that have to be resolved. So, psychological imprints of coloniality. And here I will use the psychological apparatus. Of course, methodologically, it's a bit of a stretch, because I will be talking about some therapy on the personal level, and probably it cannot be extrapolated on the level of community, but as a metaphor, I still believe it gives some useful insights. So here I will present you a famous Karpman drama triangle. When a person perceives himself or herself as a victim, it gets locked in the drama triangle. It is a triangle because there are three sides. It's not only a victim and a perpetrator, but also a rescuer. The third party is very important here. Someone whom victim is looking at and expecting him to rescue, to do something, to solve the situation, right? And here right now in our context, it's kind of obvious that if we are talking about this trauma nation, then the victim would be Ukraine, the perpetrator is Russia, and the rescue would be the international community, European Union, the West, or whatever. However, what is wrong with this triangle? Psychologists recommend to run through the therapy to escape this triangle, because the consequences are as follows. Being stuck in the drama triangle, one sticks to the victim window to the world. It starts perceiving the world from a very narrow perspective and is sort of adapting the very passive stance for himself that I can change nothing. And that's kind of denying self-agency and developing this passive life attitude, African pessimism as it is dubbed in postcolonial studies, and then delegating responsibility to others. And this delegation of responsibility is not innocent at all, because in the first place, it is a sort of moral justification for failures and wrongdoings. Whatever I'm doing, it is justified because I am a victim. And here I would mention Eva Majewska-Thompson's idea of defensive nationalism. We have suffered, so now we have the right to fight back. And then this delegation of responsibility means that you are putting a huge burden on other people's hands, that they are somehow obliged to solve your problems, which is a very unhealthy approach to life. Moreover, existing in this structure means that even if or when the danger is gone, the perpetrator is gone, the structure remains. And this empty space might be easily filled with someone else. And here I'm referring to Poland again, because it used to be Russia as the main perpetrator. But if we take a look at the current post-colonial studies in Poland, then you would see that the European Union turned into a perpetrator, filled into this position, the surrogate hegemon, as Thompson called it. And then you would see that these kind of cleavages, we're talking about two Ukraines there, they have two Polands, sort of the fake Poles, the national traitors who are liberal, pro-European, and sort of sold their nationhood for some neoliberal benefits, and sort of true Poles who are fighting for their motherland. So what I'm trying to say, that existing in this structure is very dangerous, because if you are focused, if you are looking at the world through the perspective that you're always looking for someone to blame, then you will definitely see it. And if you are looking at the negative events, because life is full of anything, but if you have a special eye only focusing on negativity, then you would definitely become very pessimistic. And the last point here is that existing in this triangle means that the roles are not fixed, in a sense that you are rotating. Even if you are a victim most of the time, you can be a perpetrator in one situation and a rescuer in another one. So it's always kind of, it's a vicious circle. So the only way to escape it is like to rethink the whole structure, not just to remove the bad people in your life, but to stop thinking this way. And one way to do that is the winner's triangle. Dwelling on Karpman's methodology, I.C. Choi in 1990 suggested a solution, how it could be reinterpreted, that the victim, the perpetrator and rescuer should change their position. Being a victim, one should take responsibility, to take back responsibility, no Brexit association, please, to take back responsibility for his own life and to think of himself as a creator. The perpetrator is a challenger, any crisis is an opportunity, right? And the rescuer does not have to rescue you. So the best you could get from him is just like an advice or whatever, but otherwise it's your job to do something about bad situations in your life. So the third part, the concluding part of my presentation, I hope I still have some minutes, Stanislav, please give me a sign. So what I do suggest here, it's extracoloniality. It's a new notion I coined, so please feel free to point that it's not an apt one. But what I meant here is that a possible way out is not denying the colonial experience, because it would be just suppressing the trauma. And that's the case how Russia is currently doing with its, or at least in the mainstream, the hegemonic approach to traumas. But rather sort of being aware, working on them, but kind of moving them to the margins, avoiding making them pillars of nation building. And for that matter, we must continue academic research on colonial experience with academic vigilance, with academic rigor and reflexivity, right? So putting intellectual checks on the political misuse of the post-colonial approach and trying to be as precise and as argumentative as possible in our research. And of course, minding this regional and global context, what's happening around. And that would be possible then to move from the captive mind, from the colonial mentality to the creative mind. By the same token, to affirm the agency through accepting responsibility, because right now, at times I have an impression that we are looking for some magic recipes. Like, once the perpetrator is gone, once Russia fails, we'll be living happily ever after. Once we join the EU, we will be living happily and prosperity. But certainly the reality is much more complicated. And being aware that it's a very good way to handle it. So I would suggest stop fixing on the past, because our future does not derive necessarily from our past. So we should keep our future open and think more about it, like Yaroslav suggested in his presentation. We should be presenting the national history as more complex by simultaneously admitting wrongdoings, so that we were not only victims all the time, but sometimes perpetrators as well, and by incorporating success stories. Because our history is rich in traumas, but also in success stories as well. They just should be properly highlighted. And in this respect, I believe that the Maidan initially was not a victimhood story. It was precisely escaping the post-colonial, the Russian colonial catch. And I believe that's exactly what meant Ilya Gerasimov when he called it post-colonial revolution, that it, in a way, it escapes the colonial logic. It stops this obsessive fixation on Russia, but just tries to open up the future and to think about our society and take back the control on it. And of course, more focus on socio-economic issues in the political domain are obviously needed. So instead of cultural elites taking this victimhood stance that people are wrong, people are bad, or whatever, their concerns should be addressed properly. And I will stop here. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much, Valeria, for your extremely interesting contribution. So again, I remind all of you to send your questions to the chat. So I think it's a good time, you know, to write your questions. It will be better maybe to organize the discussion if you write it. So maybe it will be complicated, you know, to talk everyone. So please write your questions to the discussion. So okay, thank you very much again. And now it's a time to introduce the third participant in this section, whom I think I haven't to introduce so much as well. Tamara Hundorova is corresponding member of the National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine and the head of the Theory of Literature department at the Shevchenko Institute of Literature in Kiev. She is the author of a number of important monographs, among others, The Symptoms of the Postcolonial Trauma or the Post-Chornobyl Library, Ukrainian Postmodernism of the 1990s. Professor Hundorova taught at a number of foreign universities and institutions, for example, at Harvard University, Toronto So today she will present her paper, Chornobyl Trauma and the Postcolonial Generation in Ukraine. So Professor Hundorova, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Tumis, for your introduction, and thank you, my deep thank you for the organizers for invitation me to take part in this conference. I'm going to talk today about Chernobyl trauma in post-colonial generation. At the beginning of the 21st century, trauma has become one of the central concepts of in scholar and public vocabularies. The entire history of the 20th century is associated with deeply traumatic events, Holocaust, Second World War, Hiroshima, etc., and the collapse of the Soviet Union and the socialist system as well also associate with trauma. On the one hand, it raises memories of the totalitarian past, and on the other, has a social and cultural impact manifesting itself in the body, language, and subjectivity of future generations. The theory and sociology of trauma emphasizes the issue of generations, which, as Karl Mannheim, for instance, pointed out, conceptualizes the essence of general identity as the common experience of a specific historical situation such as war, revolution, political, economical, nuclear crisis, etc. How does traumatic experience, in particular of Chernobyl, influence the post-Soviet generation? This is a question I would like to try to discuss today. In the focus of my attention will be a generational gap between so-called the 90s, 90-niki, or 90-niki, whose active period of self-identification belongs to the 1990s, and the 60s, the 60-niki, who entered the culture and politics of the Soviet Union during the late 1950s and 1960s years. After the Chernobyl disaster, the entire image of the world has changed. Disaster itself serves a point of intersection of natural, geological, climatic phenomena with social, political, and cultural factors, which brings people into a state of vulnerability. The disaster narratives usually are integrated in the wider national and political discourses. While observing the responses to disaster and catastrophe in former Soviet Union, Nigel Rabin noticed that, I quote, they provide critical insight into the nature of the Soviet state, end of quotation. In this view, it is also significant that a seemingly technogenic atomic accident in Chernobyl takes on symbolic meaning of the critical insight into the collapse of the Soviet system. It is also quite significant that after Chernobyl, the concept of a national Chernobyl, spiritual Chernobyl, ecological Chernobyl, linguistic Chernobyl entered the public usage. The very idea of spiritual Chernobyl carries over to various crises and takes on a catastrophic meaning. Chernobyl was seen, I quote, as not only a disaster of the surrounding environment, but also as a disaster in the ecology of our souls, as a catastrophe of our morality and spirituality. In other words, a tragedy signifying, I quote, the extinction of the nation, end of quotation. The idea of national Chernobyl has been developed, first of all, in the circle of Ukrainian dissident intellectuals of the 60s, who, as one of their followers notes, are adherent to the high voltage line of the spirit. For this generation of Soviet intellectuals, Chernobyl was not just a literary topic. For instance, such representative of the generation of the 60s, Ivan Drachev, Hans Verstyukin, Lina Kostenko, Boris Olinek, and many others immediately commented on the Chernobyl disaster. But for them, it is also a sign of a global post-Soviet crisis. One of the Shizdesyatniki, one of the 60s, Lina Kostenko, has made particularly extensive use of Chernobyl to convey a catastrophic ecological and humanitarian vision of it. I quote, "Leave research into the technogenic aspect of the disaster to the experts," Kostenko has said. "The entire domain of the Polishchuk's ancient culture is disappearing before our very eyes. A fatal blow has been dealt to all of what we are so often so passionately call culture and spirituality." Ultimately, Chernobyl, in Lina Kostenko's understanding, is a place where, I quote, "Ukrainian died." Her novel Notes of a Ukrainian Madman, 2010, записки українського сумасшедшего, helps us to understand how this eco-national catastrophe is connecting to the generational gap. The novel can be interpreted not only as the apotheosis of the eco-catastrophism imposed upon the Ukrainian history of the beginning of the 21st century, but also the story of a young 35-year-old IT programmer who lives at the beginning of the current millennium. The protagonist itself is represented in the novel as an instrument through which media, news, and social unconscious relay itself. News and disaster overshadow the world and turn, in the view of a character, into a kaleidoscope, where, I quote, "You shake it and there is a new picture to feast one's eyes on. You shake it and there is something new. Only now the picture gets more terrifying each time." End of quotation. Such images are a substitute for reality itself, transforming it into a permanent performance. There is a disaster there, a terrorist attack there, a methane explosion there, a military plane was accidentally blown apart by a bomb, some sort of maniac fired upon passerby, and a nerve infection broke out there. End of quotation. The catastrophic vision reflects losing the full-blooded Ukrainian nation traumatized by its colonial past, what we see in the novel by Kostenko. This attitude stems from the fact that the loss has already occurred and it cannot be stopped, and no kind of compensation, even the Maidan 2004 itself, can bring it back. But it can be assumed that this loss concerned, first of all, an ideal vision of Ukraine formulated not only by Kostenko herself as a representative of the generation of the 60s, but it is an ideal of this generation as well. Since we do not hear the actual voice of the hero himself, the character in this novel, who belongs to the generation of the 90s, he is but a means to broadcast the author's ideas. The author's perspective as the one of a generation living this stage of history is imposed on the fate of later younger generation. It is perhaps worth noting that Kostenko has repeatedly confessed to copying their main hero's character from her own son, who happens to also to be a programmer. In general, Kostenko's novel confirms that it is Chernobyl trauma that became a mirror of post-Soviet reality haunted by the repressed past. Thus, discourse surrounding Chernobyl takes in its orbit not only other traumatic events of Ukrainian history, but the new generation as well. Also, the author leaves us with a dream about the generational unity and continuum of parents and children and grandparents during the Maidan. The novel opens up the Soviet uncanny and reveals the cultural, generational, and psychological gaps in post-Soviet Ukrainian society. Oksana Zabushko, who is a representative, who represents the generation of the 90s, in her novel, The Museum of Abandoned Secrets, 2010, that was published in the same year like Lina Kostenko's novel, also refers to the family history in relation to the national history and shows a generation break forced by the totalitarian machine that ruined and devoured life of next generations. Leonid Plющin, his annotation to the novel, refers to a tertiary historic narrative frame as work about, I quote, three generations, three completely different epochs with completely different conditions. Family gap in the break of generations is one of the general predisposition of the conflict in this novel. Here, Zabushko actually continues her criticism of the generation of Шестидесятники that she started in her novel field research from Ukrainian sex, польові дослідження з українського сексу, where she criticized both the so frigid mother, whose normal life tempo was disturbed by the Holodomor of the 1930s, and the weak father connected to dissidents and infected with the fear of arrest. In her new novel, Zabushko also depicts the character of a father as the unsuccessful father, the one you wouldn't boast of. What is also severely criticized is the falsification of heroic шестидесятничество, when it became possible to enroll into the heroes who fought against the totalitarian system and write for yourself a, I quote, glamorous, almost dissident-like biography, end of quotation. Thus, having the power of the past, over her past, or into her writing and rich imagination, Darka, who in the novel is alter ego of the writer herself, divides and rules over the past. Her friends, herself, Vasil Stus, being the real victim of the system, find themselves on the one side of the barricade, while on the other side, there are all the so-called victims with an almost dissident biography. The bridge between the generation is finally built in the novel by a special magical realism. It is formed by omnipresent epiphanies and illuminations where virtual history is played on tape and comes alive, and thus becomes a part of character's life in Zabushko's novel. At the same time, the virtual characters, like father, are turned from шестидесятники, strange and unlucky people, who into existentially close character related by Sisyphus wish to fight their own physiologically inborn fear. The generational gap, which makes the introductory stage in the novel, is overcome in this way. The weak father, that one could only be ashamed of, is reborn in the unity of his presence into a man worth admiration. I quote, to admire, but not as father, no, because for that he was already too far in time, but to admire as a person whom I could get acquainted with, end of quotation. Kostenko national catastrophism and Zabushko's magical utopia, written in the form of postcolonial novel, both touch upon the conflict of generation, and it is very significant. In some ways, they refer to the generation identification that could be actualized in Ukraine at the beginning of the 1990s. The revolution on granite, today we have 30 years anniversary of this revolution on granite, becomes one of the acts of a generation self-assertion of the 90s. Although the 90s were closely connected to the dissident movement, many of these dissidents were released after a long period of captivity in the mid to late 1980s, and their energizing effect on Ukrainian civil society and students, it's hard to neglect, but the 90s were doing something else. They substitute their so-called parents for their contemporaries, recognizing them as a new leader. Students' hunger strike in 1990s testified to the birth of a new generation. For me, October 1990s means the birth of a new creative generation who even now stay in the vanguard, said Taras Batenko in 2000, and who represent this new generation. He even formulates the alternative canon of this new generation, who in this opinion managed, unlike шестидесятники, to turn a riot into a real fact. I quote, this generation has cultural persons who, being still alive, are already classical. Юрий Андрухович, Виктор Неборак, Volodymyr Cybulko, Oksana Zabushko, etc. It has politically committed fathers in an internal creative impulse, namely Markian Ivashtishin and Les Doni. It has had intellectual products like Vivakh, Молоде Vino, anthology, association 500, and new generation structure, etc. End of quotation. Next year, Oles Donyi, in his turn, claimed about the so-called the death of Шестидесятники. He believed that Шестидесятничество was a myth. I quote, it was a myth about intelligentsia. And the degradation of the Шестидесятничество favors the complete degradation of intelligentsia in its former meaning. Шестидесятничество is dead, just like the myth about the intelligentsia generation fighting for democracy. The ancient myths about the fact that all those who fought for Ukrainian independence and all who speak literary Ukrainian language are true Democrats. End of quotation. Starting from the 1990s, generational identity in Ukrainian literature is fixed according to decade. The 1980s generation, the 1990s generation, and the 2000 generation all rush to declare themselves. Generational solidarity becomes the defining aspect of this decade-oriented identification. This solidarity fosters support in the reproduction not only of a specific group identity, but postcolonial identification as well. We usually say that the older generation who grew up under socialism were compelled to make a sudden reassessment of their values during the 1990s. However, post-totalitarian trauma also affect young people, children who did not experience or experienced it only partially the influence of the socialist system. This trauma gives rise to feeling of uncertainty and instability. It severs familiar connection between parents and children, destroys one's sense of historical continuity, prompts dissociative behavior and generational resentment. Transgenerational effect of trauma are not only psychological, but familial, social, cultural, neurobiological, and possibly even genetic as well, as contemporary scholar emphasized, and is a part of contemporary studies that is exploring whether and how mass cultural and historical traumas affect future generations. In post-Soviet Ukrainian society, recollection of traumatic events of the 20th century impose themselves upon the Chernobyl disaster, and the trauma of Chernobyl becomes one of the central links in the post-Soviet catastrophic consciousness. Actually, as Paul Virilio said, those who witnessed Chernobyl are witnesses of a quote, catastrophic beginning. In Chernobyl, in his view, is the start of a new kind of history, which he calls catastrophic history. I stop at this. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much also for your interesting contribution. So now we can try how our discussion will follow. So thank you for question which you put into the chat. So there are a number of questions to Professor Hrytsak and Valeria Korablyova. So maybe before putting them, so maybe I would like to Professor Hrytsak to use my privilege to ask. I wanted to ask you about the state of the fight against the corruption, and if the representatives of civic society in Orange Revolution and later Euromaidan didn't lose their zeal, or if they were replaced by another generation. So what and my question is if it's real, you know, to fight or to win in this question. So to remove corruption from Ukrainian society. So maybe it was one of the most important question of all revolutions in Ukraine. So what is the state today in this question?
Thank you for your question. I wish I knew the answer, so to say.
Yeah,
this is like a very subjective take. Yeah. I would say that corruption could not be erased. Corruption could be reduced. So the main challenge, how to reduce corruption to a certain acceptable minimum, if I may say so. And I would say the general tendency is there. There is some reduction of corruption. Let's face it, there is, but and on the one hand, on the other hand, there is what is really important is the fact of the second Maidan, that there is certain intolerance to corruption. Corruption always stands on the first points as the main problems of Ukraine in the survey, which is quite new effect, so to say. So, but the story is when it comes to corruption, fight against corruption in the terms of institution, a lot has been done.
Thank you.
But the real problem is a court system.
Mm-hmm.
You cannot produce, you couldn't prove the case of corruption unless you have a just law system. And this is not the main problem. So I believe the main problem that Ukraine faces is how to reform the court, so to say. Jurisdictional reform, судова reform, court reform. I know the details. I've been in the committee that's been elected, the head of the corruption committee. So I would say from my own experience that this is the main problem nowadays. How to bring the case, so to say, to the court, and how to prove the case. So far we are failing in this dimension. I'm sorry to tell that.
Okay, thank you very much. So maybe I will continue with some questions for Professor Hrytsak here in discussion, and then we will continue with other participants in discussion. So there is a question, maybe you can see it in so it seems that Poroshenko's European solidarity is currently the most popular pro-European political force in Ukraine. With Holo's political twilight, it is reasonable to ask, is there a chance that European solidarity will, after all, become the golden middle party? What should be changed in its political agenda to be able to play this role? So,
thank you so much for your question, Alexandra. I hate to say it, but I believe the European Solidarity Party has no chance to become a middle. It's too late. It's too late, and more so, I know that more I know about this party, more than this leader, enough more move to the kind of the west direction and considers intentionally so the West, specifically Galicia, as their main turf, so to say. I don't deny that they have chances to come to power again, and probably Poroshenko would be the next president. At least he dreams about that. But so far, his rhetoric, and more so his behavior, doesn't indicate that he's ready to take any kind of middle position, so to say. And more so, this has been confirmed by the surveys, because basically people in the surveys refer to him as the party of the National Democrats, so to say, which is not the middle term. I'm afraid to tell that Poroshenko has lost this chance. He had these intentions. With the extension 1013, I know from my own personal experience, he's dealing with him and his team. But nowadays, I'm afraid to say it's too late. We're still waiting. The niche is still there. The vacuum is still there for somebody to fill in. But I believe it won't be Poroshenko, but maybe somebody else. Let's wait and see.
Okay, thank you very much. So maybe there could be any other questions for Professor Hrytsak from audience, if someone wants to ask another question. So you can use your chance to ask Professor Hrytsak. Maybe I can give you 10 seconds.
Let's count.
Maybe you can come back. Yeah.
No, I'll be there. There are some questions.
Okay. So another questions are here for Valeria Korablyova, but again, I will use my privilege to ask one question. So you talk about staying in the past in many ways of Ukrainian society. So I would like to ask you about if you compared, for example, the situation in the state of Israel and Ukraine, because maybe of some questions of Holocaust and the question of Holodomor, which can interlink maybe both states, because sometimes Holodomor is taught in the sense of Holocaust as well, and of course Holocaust was also a very important problem in Ukraine during the Second World War. So if you can compare those experiences, for example, of both societies, because it seemed to me, for example, when I was in Israel, that this society face very similar, maybe even a more serious problem than Ukrainian society in this sense. So if you can comment on it, please.
Yeah, thank you so much, Stanislav, for a very interesting question. I will not go that far as to go in details because I'm not really a specialist on Israel and I would not speculate here. But how I can comment on this question is that the Holocaust as a tragedy is one of the cornerstones of the European Union. As Tony Judd famously said, it is an entry ticket to the EU to recognize that it is unprecedented and sort of nothing. So it should not be doubted first and nothing should be on par with it secondly, right? But before it became the sort of the hegemonic discourse, there were many opinions, and in Ukraine, some scholars were voicing this thinking that if Holodomor had been properly recognized back then, that the Holocaust would not have happened, the sort of the alertness, because the realpolitik thinking that once you tolerate some evil because it's peripheral, it could be neglected for the sake of some major geopolitical interest, then it results in bigger evils, right? So never sort of compromise with the evil. But I believe it's a very risky undertaking engaging in any sorts of comparison because it's really overloaded with political and moral meanings. Israel does exist in a very specific area and all these compromises around are really needed. So me personally, I would refrain from the competitive martyrology anyway, right? Not only with Israel, but generally I believe it's like a dead-end road. So we should think of some more creative ways of delivering our version of history.
Okay, thank you very much. And yeah, please.
And there are many questions in the chat. So if I have any
questions, so I don't know if I should read it, but maybe you can see the chat. So maybe
absolutely yes. Well, first of all, I want to thank for very interesting and engaging question, which means that somehow my talk resonated. I'm very happy about it. I would start with a question from Verena Meister. Meister, sorry, I don't know how to pronounce it correctly. So the connection between being stuck in victimhood and heroism, well, basically these are two sides of the same coin, because presenting oneself as a hero is the jump from the victim corner to the rescue corner, because a hero rescues someone and sacrifices something for the sake of the common good. So it's again this vicious circle of the victimhood thing. And the real alternative is, from the psychological theory perspective, is the role of an adult. So instead of sort of going back and forth between a victim and a hero, it should be like more balanced self-identity, more balanced approach. And then there are a couple of questions rightly poking at the weak point of my methodology. As I said, the whole idea of mentality, how it is methodologically useful, Elena Martinyuk is asking, and how do I elaborate on collective consciousness? And Yulia Yurchuk goes along the same lines. Yulia, I'm very happy that you joined us today. I don't know all of you, sorry, but Yulia is a well-known scholar from Zedronton University, and really happy that you join us today. And basically she asks again the same about the mentality and the national unconscious. Yes, indeed, it's a very methodologically challenging question to me, but what can I say as a sort of reaction to that, the notion of post-colonial mentality is part and parcel of the post-colonial studies. So whenever we are talking, because the main pathos or the main strategic move of the post-colonial studies is that political anti-colonization is not everything. It's just the first step of the liberation. But before gaining independence, after gaining like political independence, then you have to decolonize yourself. And these remnants of the colonial past, they work on this level of mentality. So the post-colonial, so basically the decolonization endeavor is about tracing the post-colonial traits in yourself and trying to uproot them, or at least to be aware of that and to overcome that. And going to the first part of Yulia's question is how I distinguish post-coloniality, decoloniality, and extracoloniality, all this notional play game. Well, first of all, we know that there are post-colonial studies sort of associated with deconstructionist, postmodernist theory, and also with specific region coming more sort of from India and this Asian region, and then the decoloniality with Kijano and Mignolo coming from Latin America and claiming that they were colonized even earlier, starting from the 15th century and so on and so forth. So how I'm tackling it in my presentation, to put it simply and concise, that post-coloniality is basically the current situation with the whole colonial legacy. Right? Decoloniality is an effort to get rid of this colonial legacy. And extracoloniality is a sort of specific stance, which means taking a distance from the colonial experience, being aware of it, but not putting it in the center of nation building and of any political endeavors. If it answers your question. So did I miss anything in? Yeah, I think I received also several questions in. Thank you. I would like to follow up. I really know that we can engage in a very interesting discussion. I hope there will be a chance once we decolonize. Miroslava Znayenko, in the context of I will read because I think you do not see that. In the context of counteracting re-imperialization, what methods would you propose to restrain from the increasing onslaught of the Russian Orthodox Church and its Ruski Mir ideology? Here I would quote on Professor Hrytsak, I wish I knew. My point was that any reaction to the Russian strategic measures should be not immediate and asymmetrical. So engaging immediately in any provocation usually does not bring us any benefit, because being reactive is a very weak position, right? And as I said, so instead of promoting the Ukrainians as something good by using the moral capital that we have suffered, we should move to the direction that something changes in the country and people live better. And that's sort of, so the symbolic game should not be a kind of a false flag, right? But people should feel that they do live better. So maybe that would be an answer. And Oksana Salata, great to see you here as well. I remember you took part in one of our previous conferences. What is the role of intellectual elite in modern Ukraine, or is it business leading? Or, you know, what is fascinating about Ukraine, that it's a very diverse country in many respects. And intellectual elites, there is no coherent intellectual elite, because we have many sort of elites playing on different fields, some of them as advisors to politicians, some of them trying to exercise this pedagogical mission, some of them trying to engage in some local initiatives and gain some insights from them. So I do believe that, of course, the role of intellectual elites is very important, but I wouldn't call the country led by them. So right now we are in the situation then people are very frustrated. And if we look at the sociological polls, I do like, you know, this total polling by the National Academy of Sciences Institute of Sociology, because they're measuring and asking many, many questions. And when we look at the level sort of happiness of people, it's always very low. And there was one peak after the Orange Revolution, and it never kind of approached that level, with this, again, a small peak in 2019. So it's kind of an indirect factor that shows that people are usually get excited and get frustrated soon afterwards, and they are like shadow stakeholders, and they're looking to whom delegate responsibility for their future, to whom invest the trust. And it's quite situational. At times, these are politicians. At times, these are opinion leaders, cultural elites. At times, they are populists and so on. So it's not stable, it's fluctuating. So that would be my take on that.
Okay, thank you very much. So I think it's all question here in chat on Valeria, but maybe someone want to ask another question in the audience. Again, maybe 10 minutes, 10 seconds, you know, to ask.
I think Radomir wants to ask a question to Professor Hundorova.
Yeah, please. So it's a time now for questions for Professor Hundorova. So again, I would like to use my privilege to ask one question. So I am very much interested how Chernobyl is perceived now in Ukrainian society, and especially what is the role of writers. Some of them were meant on today perception of Chernobyl reality in Ukraine, because it seemed to me that Ukrainian society, from my visits, lives in different topics more than with Chernobyl, but maybe it's just my perception of this thing. So maybe if you can comment on it, so I will appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for your question. Yes, Chernobyl disaster and Chernobyl catastrophe influenced very strongly the consciousness, post-Soviet consciousness in Ukraine and contemporary Ukrainian, and it's still a very topical problem in Ukraine. And what is very interesting, if you look at the evolution of this reception, first of all, during the first years after this Chernobyl disaster, most of the people use it as a metaphor of so-called catastrophism upon the end of the history, end of the world, this apocalyptic event, and so on. And but then later on, the discourse of Chernobyl has been changed slowly, and it seems to me now we face a kind of reinvention of Chernobyl, in a kind of overcoming victimization that dominated during the last time. And it's a kind of reloading of Chernobyl. Chernobyl was start to consider in a more large context, more global, connected to the collapse of the Soviet Union, the first one, and then technological catastrophe, and also the national building as well. And especially it is a very productive field for creator, for writer, for performer, for performance. And in Ukraine now we can see in, for instance, movie theater, literature, drama, opera, new opera, for instance, they all took this subject, and it is very interesting. What is very significant that Chernobyl is seen in aspect of post-apocalyptic view, not only like a big catastrophe, but a kind of to look how to overcome this catastrophe, how to live in this situation of the end, of the ending, I would say. So Chernobyl still is one of the central points, central event of post-Soviet time in Ukraine, and many dimensional aspect, but is very interesting in general.
Okay, thank you very much. So there are other questions for Professor Hundorova. Radko Mokrik asked me for posing of his questions. Also, Radko, you can ask.
Yeah, if I may. Do you hear me?
Please.
Thank you for your great presentation, and very interesting for me because you've mentioned a couple of times the generation of the 60s, so it was quite interesting to me, and that's what I'm trying to understand, this conflict of generations that you've mentioned a couple of times. I guess that Kostenko herself during the 90s stated that the 60s have become some kind of dissidents again in Ukraine, and they are some kind marginalized, and you've mentioned this Oles Denis statement about this generation. We do remember the scandal that happened in Lviv after this book was published, and I guess that as we've been talking about the elections, and the intellectuals, and for example, Ivan Zuba supported one candidate, and no one listened to it, and so on and so forth. So I wanted to ask, what's the problem indeed? Because if we generalize a little bit, it is possible to say that, for example, I guess so, I think so, that in Poland or in Czech Republic, these dissidents in some sense remained kind of authorities for the society, but in Ukraine we can really say that it's a problem, this conflict of generation. And what's the difference? Why did it happen? Okay.
Yes, thank you for very, very good question. Yes, it seems to me that this notion of marginalization of the 60s, or 60 as a new dissident in contemporary Ukrainian is very, very, very interesting. The problem, it seems to me, is that the 60s and the phenomenon шестидесятництво are still a part of some kind of a heroic history. And this, I would say, anti-dissident, anti-totalitarian aspect of their history, their biography, is still the most popular. And the discourse does not go beyond this model, and it seems to me this discourse, in my view, should be in some way be desecularized or deconstructed, and we very strongly need to do it, because шестидесятники in mass view is still today some kind of sacral images. So this sacrum remain untouched during the last year after independence as well. And it seems to me it's opposite, does not help to understand us the meaning of this phenomenon, which is very interesting, like in political aspect, in psychological, also in moral. So what we need, it seems to me, we need more to look at them as an individual, as a subject, to know more about their biography, about their mind, about their conflict, and so on, to make them more human, I would say. And it seems to me it's a way to understand them and to put them from the pedestal to the real, and to see them like very interesting people. Actually, they are so. They are idol in Ukrainian. They are still, for instance, Vasil Stus. Recently this book by Kipiani, and this is a new icon of Ukrainian societies, I would say. And we live in some way. We live even today in the kind of white and black opposition, and we see the word in the past history in this diachronical way.
Okay, thank you. So maybe there are other two questions, and we have not so much time now. So maybe very quick question.
No, it's okay. It's okay. I'll leave.
Yeah, so there are other two questions. So maybe now we have to answer quickly. So from Ivan Kozachenko, what is the role of Ukrainian diaspora in intellectual framing Chornobyl as a moral catastrophe? And then is also the question about the HBO Sky drama Chornobyl in 2019. So could you?
Yes, I will. My answer will be very short. Yes, of course, Chernobyl. This mini serial Chernobyl is very popular in Ukraine, and it for many Ukrainians it opened their own history. But to my mind, this film can be also be viewed more critically, because it has some mythology that it developed also, and some program, and many facts that are opposite, and the survivors and the liquidators, they don't accept many things in this movie. So, but to my mind, this is the most the biggest influence of this movie is that it gives an opportunity to go back to Chernobyl and to start thinking about Chernobyl again in a more critical, in a more complex way.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So I'm not sure if Valeria wanted to ask to Professor Hundorova as well, but there is some question also for Valeria in connection to HBO Sky drama Chernobyl, and Valeria want to ask Professor Hrytsak one more question. So please, Valeria.
Yeah, thank you for this opportunity. I was somehow missed in this scenario when I'm allowed to jump in. So yeah, thanks to both presenters for your very interesting discussions. But I wanted to ask Yaroslav, because I'm really very much interested in this topic, and I have two quick questions. So the first assumption you are starting with, I believe that's this Engelhardt assumption about this post-generational move that you kept saying that it's generational, and once we essentialize it, can we challenge it, or can we at least give it a grain of doubt? Because what we see the developments in Poland, for instance, that the youngest generation has the widest support for peace party, right? So it's not something which we should take for granted. So far, it's not the case in Ukraine, but sort of we cannot rely on that and take it for granted. Yeah, that was my first question. And the second one about the World Value Survey, which you referred to. Indeed, Ukraine made a significant drift towards the values of self-realization. However, it is accompanied by Russia and Belarus. They really stuck together in this move. And that makes me question this historical teleology. You are talking about long-term trends. And from what we see in this chart, it looks like whether you have the Maidan or stagnation or this or that, there is this sort of telos of history which brings you towards these values of self-realization. So how would you comment on that?
Thank you so much. God forbid, take anything for granted. This is why we are here. So if you're talking about the first generation, one generation in one country doesn't refer to the other generation in the other country. It's very important, because there must be some kind of the formative experience. So formative experience of Ukraine in the 0 years was the same experience as the Poland in the 0 years. So this is a very short question, very short answer to your question. So in this sense, Poland and Ukraine could not be compared as very much as Ukrainian generation could not be compared to Russia, so to say. So that's cross-general, as to say. So that's very specific, very specific. I would go with this in details, but if you look at the last chart I have there, you will see that there is new generation started with 1986, which is very, very much different. I would say two factors which correlated and act with each other, accumulated effect. One was the relative democracy, after the victory of the first Maidan. And secondly, the fact that's very missed, we have a kind of the economic rise for the whole 10 years. And this is accumulation of two facts which gave this kind of the result. Secondly, I don't claim there is significant shift, no way. And I believe there is no significant shift in either Belarus or Russia. There is a sudden shift, that's for sure. But what's important there, that there is a shift. And without this shift, it would be hard to explain what's going on in Belarus nowadays, because something happened there. And we were talking then several years ago that something has to happen in Belarus. What would happen in Russia, it doesn't mean that this trend works automatically. A lot depends on the cultural milieu and on organization political elites. To put it simply, if there is only one source of information, and the source of information is TV, which is controlled, you could hardly get this kind of the democratization. This is what Engelhardt says. Engelhardt doesn't say the main fact. It's not, Engelhardt is not Karl Marx. What he says, there are chances, there are tendencies, and tendencies may work and may not. So this is what I'm claiming it. So basically, and again, the strong fact of the Engelhardt is empirical character. You don't speculate with this. You have empirical factor, you try to see on the maps and you try to see this kind of drift. There is a drift. What will lead to, I don't know, but what I'm trying to say in there, that in Ukraine, you have some kind of the conditions which are conducive to this democratization, which is relative democracy, which means constant change of elites. And secondly, nobody really, there is no monopoly control on the mass media. And these are two very important factors which helps to work in this direction. Again, as I'm saying, again, Engelhardt is not reductionist. He doesn't say that his scheme explains everything. It just helps to think, help to prognosis. But chances are, history never works at that automatically. So this is my answer.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So maybe the last chance for the very last question for someone in the audience, if someone wants to ask.
I don't know if I should comment on the question from Elena Denisova.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
Right. Again, thank you, Elena, the colleague from Switzerland. I'm happy to see you here. I partly hinted on possible ways of implementation, and I believe that, for instance, teaching history in secondary schools is a very important issue in Ukraine, which is heatedly debated all the time. But sort of the shift, if we start giving some relevant information, facts, and knowledge and narratives that would be not re-victimizing Ukraine, that would be helpful, because judging by what I hear from students from the generation that Yaroslav was referring to, there is quite a salient demand for that. So that would be the idea how we can move. But it's not like my political grand plan that I want to implement. Rather, I'm trying to expose the directions in which we can think and move.
Okay, so thank you very much. So it seems we are at the end of this section. So thank you to all contributors for their papers and also for really great discussion about many topics. So thank you very much. So I give now word Valeria.
Thank you so much, Stanislav, for your moderation, for your excellent moderation and insightful questions in reaching our debate. And thanks to everyone, to our brilliant presenters and to our brilliant audience with very smart questions. So we are perfectly on time so far. We are moving just on schedule. So now we have half an hour of virtual coffee break. And then in half an hour, I'm strongly encouraging you to join us again for the next session, which would be a very interesting one, presenting specific cases. So we will zoom in and see the diversity inside Ukraine and focus on specific regions, on Odessa and on Kharkiv. So see you in half an hour. Thank you.